Alright everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today I'm going to show you how I mixed my latest song, A Call Beyond. In today's video, I'm not going to cover my composition process, like how I wrote the song. I think what I want to do is just focus on the pure mixing side of everything and maybe some arrangement details. And I want to cover maybe how I wrote the song in a separate video, because it's all based on that very first clean guitar motif that you hear after the orchestra intro. If that's a video that you think you might be interested in, then please let me know in a comment below and yeah, I'll make it happen. So now that you've heard a little snippet of the song, if you want to check out the full thing, then please go and watch the music video or stream the song on Spotify. So this song was written kind of for my signature guitar, and it has already come out. It celebrates like the lead up to the guitar releasing, which it will be really soon. So yeah, let's dig right into it and check out some of the stuff that I've done on this. All right, cool. So now we're in Logic. As you can see, there is a lot of tracks. Like, it's not an insane amount. Like, we're at about 180 something. Yeah, 179. But, you know, some of the tracks are like doing very little. Like, this is an entire track and it just plays like 2 harmonies for the solo. So try not to be overwhelmed. We'll go through it piece by piece and I'll try and explain everything that is happening like right in front of you right now, and take you through my mix decisions, and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two. And if you're just curious as to why the song sounds like it does, then please feel free to grab a tea, coffee, glass of wine or a beer, and yeah, I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to go through this chronologically, so there's some sort of sense as to what's happening as we go through each section. So normally I would usually talk about the drums first in a song, as most of my songs start with drums, but this one doesn't. It actually starts with a single guitar. But before we dive right into the intro, I just want to talk about the initial motif. I've been sat on this motif for, I don't know, maybe like a year and a half. It was when I got my very first Salin Classic, and it was so special to me because it had a tremolo on it, and Salins had never had tremolos on before. So what was really cool about that was I'd been asking for one for a really long time, and the fact that Ola had made it happen is really cool. And yeah, I just so happened to write this like A string tapped and pull off thing that kind of doesn't really resolve on the one. I guess you'll hear that when we dive into it. And I'd been sat on it for so long. I wasn't really decided on what groove I should do, but since receiving the prototype of my signature, what I decided to do was initially take the drop D tuning that it was in and tune up half a step. So the tuning of this song is in drop E flat. So imagine tuning your entire 6-string guitar up a half step so that you're in F, and then dropping your 6th string again. So then you're going down to E flat. So what you would have is E flat, B flat, E flat again, and then you would have A flat, C and F. I believe that's right. If I'm wrong, I'll put it up on the screen, but I'm sure that's right. So it's kind of weird to have high strings as open strings. So I wanted to make use of that. Like, that's what this main riff is pulling off on the open, would normally be the G string, but in this case it's an A flat. As well as the 5th string normally would be an A, but it's a B flat. So it's a lot of that sort of pulling off stuff. Anyway, enough of me talking, let's dive right into the intro. Just wanted to give you a little bit of, I guess, trivia to the song right there. So let's listen to what we've got going on here. So the song starts literally like this. That's the vibe of the intro. This guitar is just one of my clean patches from the quad, so I can't really show you the exact sound that I got on the quad, but it's a super simple, just like clean with the reverb and delay that's obviously been printed into Logic, and then there's a little bit of EQ just to take off some of the high end. First thing I just want to touch on before we get into the nitty-gritty detail is all of my instruments are going into an instrument bus, which you can see up here. and that looks like this. We'll run through that really quickly so you can hear what it's doing to the track, and then we'll work through chronologically, which makes more sense. And separate to that is an orchestra bus. So they aren't speaking to each other. They're going individually, kind of up a pyramid. So individual tracks, instrument bus, which is like guitars, bass, synths, layers, everything that isn't orchestra is going to that bus. And it's all getting compressed, saturated. And then the orchestra bus is staying entirely separate. And then they're just coming together right at the very end for like the mastering stage at the stereo out. I'll put something on the screen to kind of illustrate that a little bit better. I think it's something that's often overlooked is the track structure of a mix and how you're bussing everything. So just think of it like files and folders. Like I have all my instruments staying over here so that I can process them separately from the orchestra. And then the orchestra is just its own thing entirely. And they just meet up right at the very end. Similar to how you might process vocals on a track, you might want to keep your vocals separate from your instrument bus. So yeah, kind of taken from that school of thought, really. So let's just put on, I'm just going to loop a really small section of the track. So for those of you who don't know the track, who are just watching this video, you can hear the mix and see what the instrument bus is doing. For the entirety of this video, I'm going to keep the master bus on just because it's purely just doing a volume boost, because otherwise this session is really quiet. But yeah, right, let's listen to what the instrument bus is doing. Alright, so I'm going to take everything off this instrument bus. This faded out channel EQ is just a little bit of automation. I'll show you what that's doing later when we hit the big riff. But it's not doing anything that colors the sound. It's literally just like a filter that's on the instrument bus for one little moment. So I'm going to take everything off and then we can hear what is happening on the instrument bus. It is putting in a fair amount of work. So once you hear this without, like, the track kind of falls apart, in my opinion, but not in a bad way. Just I really like mixing into like a bus compressor, like the API. So when we get to that stage, you'll hear all of a sudden the sound of the track, as you probably know it if you've heard it already, will come back. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mute the orchestra, because obviously we'll touch on what's happening on that bus in a second. So this is just pure instruments now. Cool, so the first plugin is the Hitsville EQ, the mastering version. I just really like what this EQ does. It's from the UA Spark collection. So if you're interested in, actually, like, a lot of these plugins are from the Spark collection. So if you're interested in what these are doing to the track, feel free to check out the Spark subscription from UA. Yeah, so this is what this EQ is doing. As you can see here, if you're not familiar with this plugin, we've got the frequencies down here. And there's this cool switch you can flick. So normally in the normal mode, hence normally, you can see these black numbers here. We've got 12.5K, 5K, 2K, 800, 320, 130 and 50. But if you do half frequency, the half speed variant, you can get half values. So you can kind of play with the parameters of what you're changing. And you can also decide to dip or peak each band. And the reason why there's two is because it's a stereo EQ, so you can either do mid-side or left and right. I believe I'm just in left-right at the moment. It's just like more of a simple EQ. So what I'm doing is boosting 50, 130 and 320 all by a dB. And I quite like how you can just, there's no decimals. It's either 1 or 0 dB. Like, you make a decision and that's like what you get. Same thing for the 800 hertz as well. That's also a peak, and I'm dipping 2000. And then for the final two, I'm boosting a little bit of high end as well. So that's like 12.5K is like top end of your orchestra, and maybe some, you know, cymbals. Really not much else you're going to get up there. It's just that high end shimmer that you're going to push out the track. And 5K yeah, you're talking like the hair on your guitars, maybe like the top end distortion of your bass and some other parts that you might be pushing there. So I'm gonna start with it off and then I'm gonna put it in. And throughout this video, you might see me bypassing the plugins using this little in button. It's just a better bypass than Logic's normal. You won't get any like gap in sound. So when it's white, it's off, and when it's gold or yellow, it's on. So start with it off, and then I'll put it on, and there is a bit of a volume lift. I am pushing it a little bit. I just like what it's doing. So a really powerful EQ. I love having it on the mix bus, or the instrument bus in this case. And that's going straight into a tape machine. It's the Studer A800. Love this tape machine on the instrument bus. So I use this in a pretty transparent way. It's just, again, pretty standard settings actually. You know, the 456 tape, you can choose from a number of them. And I've always just liked the 456. The calibration's +6 and the IPS is 15, so it's fairly transparent. Maybe we'll go with translucent. It's definitely doing something to the sound. And if it's not obvious already, I would super recommend headphones or a good pair of speakers or monitors to listen to this video on. Because if you're on phone speakers watching this, you're probably not going to hear what this is doing. It's just going to fatten up the super low end. Think about the heart of the kick drum, 60 Hertz. Low end of the bass, and just a little bit more shimmery top end as well, and it's just giving some of that tape flavor to the whole track. So start with it off and then with it on. So much more subtle compared to that EQ. Again, I think I mostly wanted to bring out a bit more bottom end on that kick and that bass. So that's what I did there. So the next thing is actually a Logic stock EQ. It's the vintage graphic EQ, which I believe like everyone should have access to. It comes with Logic. It's in the vintage EQ collection. If you don't have any plugins at all and you're just in Logic using stock plugins, I would implore you to check out the vintage EQs. They are absolutely amazing. You get like a Pultec one, a Neve style one, and I can't remember what this one is sort of based off, but I like to use it to push just shimmery high end. The drive output is really fun to play with as well if you're trying to get a bit more like punchy saturation. I'm not really using it here. I'm literally on like 0.5. But the main thing I'm doing is everything is not being touched apart from 8K, 16K. So the Hitsville only goes up to 12.5, and the thing that I like to do is just push a tiny bit more shimmer just out the top end, just of like the cymbals, and it's like, you know, like 0.4 dB and then 8K is 0.3. So this is kind of like the tape machines handled the bottom end. Now this is going to handle the top shimmer. So again, tiny details here, but I just like to mess with this sort of stuff. So again, just listen to the cymbals and you might be able to hear like a little bit of a difference, like a lift. So yeah, once again with it off and then with it on. Next we've got another EQ. This is just cutting any subs that I might not want, and I'm talking subs like it's just under 25 Hertz. It's just in case anything weird's coming through. It's probably not even necessary, but it's something I've just learned that I should do. So personally need to do a little bit more research to find out if this is a necessary move or not on the entire mix. So yeah, let me know if any of you got opinions on that in the comments below. Some more light EQ going on. I'm cutting out a little bit of 2.5K. That's the main move on this EQ. Just to get rid of some of that like it's kind of no man's land of guitar tone. It's not like shimmery high end or like the nice like distortion part of the gain on distorted guitars, but it's not like meaty body of it either. It's sort of somewhere in between and a little bit whistly. So I just reduced that, and yeah, it's on the entire mix. It just helps. It's kind of like it scoops it, but not in a mid cut kind of way. But yeah, I'd recommend trying this move on some of your mixes and let me know how you get on. Pretty narrow Q, so it's not doing a whole lot. And then yeah, I've got another slight cut at 300 and another tiny cut at 700. So yeah, with it off and then on, you'll be able to hear like a slight difference. Alright, this is going to transform the sound and make it a lot more squishy, punchy, polished, glued, and I will always probably love this compressor for that reason. I just think it's so good at doing like the mix bus compression sort of thing. It's probably, I mean, you know, the clue's in the name, it's kind of what it's designed for. But yeah, it's a stereo compressor. If you're looking for a vibe similar to this, I would check out the G Comp from SSL. Gets a very similar vibe. I know a lot of people do 4:1 on the ratio, which is what I've done here. Typically I would do 3:1, but I think I just pushed it a bit more. Fairly typical settings from there. So we've got a 0.3 millisecond attack and a 100 millisecond release. It's a little bit confusing that it says second release here, but it's 0.1, so 100 milliseconds. The variable doesn't really matter in my opinion from my testing. Oh, let me turn it on so you can see. So yeah, the tone, hard knee, medium detector on the thrust. So that's basically telling the compressor to accentuate the mids and the highs. Well, not accentuate, listen more towards the mid-range and the high end and ignore a bit more of the low end. So it's kind of like that classic filtering out like up to 80 hertz. So you're not compressing the kick as much as you would like the snare. So I've tried the normal and the loud on the thrust detector, but medium for me personally works the best. When I was reading the manual for the API, that looked to me like it was the best sort of mode to fit what I like to do with the compressor anyway, which is to kind of ignore some of that low end and clamp down on the mid and the high end. I've got the left-right link completely individual. It's just the way I like to do things. And then the filter shape is high pass as well. And then from there, it's basically just, I'm looking for about 3 dBs of gain reduction. This is a pretty big section, so it might be a little bit more than that, but in the verse groove, it could be around 3, or clamping down on the snare, maybe even a bit less. So I'm gonna start with it off, put it on, and then yeah, I mean, I think you should be able to hear a pretty big difference. So yeah. So obviously it's got a volume boost. It's not really something I do on purpose, but hopefully you can hear the sides are being pushed a lot in volume and the snare is getting clamped quite a lot. So it's no longer just sounding like a pretty clean snare that doesn't have any processing on it. It's getting clamped down quite a lot with a 4:1 ratio. So it's got a lot of glue to the sound now. And yeah, the final thing I'll go through separately, like it's just to filter more of a creative like production EQ. So that's the instrument bus. And finally, we'll cover the orchestra bus as we go through the intro. So let's move on to that now. Okay, awesome. So the intro, it starts off with a single guitar actually. and it was just an idea I had to have a pedal note. Like, I love pedal notes, so I wanted to do something with a pedal note here and have like a single note on guitar that's like, I wouldn't say like an uninteresting rhythm, but it's just pretty stable. And then what I really wanted to do here, which I'm so glad a few of you noticed in the comments of the music video anyway, is I really wanted the orchestra to shine. I wanted this kind of grandiose, cinematic, like unveiling of the guitar, really. I had this vision in my head to be walking towards the guitar, picking it up, and as those slow reveals happen, like we get this huge swelling chord from the brass, and a lot of you seem to dig it, so really happy that you liked that. So, well, let's dig into how I made the intro and how I mixed it. So yeah, obviously we start off with this guitar, and that's the only thing you hear for the first couple bars. So that's just a quad cortex guitar, just pretty simple, clean, a little bit of reverb and delay, nothing special. And it's just got a little bit of EQ on it just to smooth off that top end and cut a bit of bass. So with it off and on really quickly, it just sounds like this. So I'm just going to talk you through what the orchestra bus is doing. It's not as involved as the instrument bus, but it's still got a little bit of source going on it. So yeah, let me solo the orchestra and then I'll talk about what's happening. Just so you can have a vibe of what the orchestra's doing first, here's what it sounds like. Let me just talk through what's happening. Firstly, it's just a simple volume trim on the entire orchestra. I felt like, yeah, I don't know why I did that here, but I just did. We might discover that throughout this entire mix I've forgotten why I've done a few things, but that just kind of happens when you're in the flow state and you make decisions whilst you probably could have trimmed the threshold here, but yeah, it's fine, it's fine. So going into a separate API, different settings here. So we've only got a 2:1 ratio on the compressor, 200 millisecond release, and same attack, 0.3 millisecond. But what the difference is here, probably the biggest thing, is the mix is only on 50%. I didn't say it before, but the mix on the normal instrument bus compressor is 100%. So half of the unprocessed signals coming through here and the other half is what the compressor is doing. So it's hitting the compressor harder, but you're only hearing half of it. Does that make sense? And we've got a soft knee, soft detector as well. So much less of an aggressive sound. It's still adding a nice bit of glue to the orchestra though. So with it off, I'll play from like, you know, when the entire like string section comes in as well as the brass, and you'll hopefully be able to hear what the compressor's doing. It's probably a bit more subtle than the instrument bus though. So yeah. Just a bit of glue on that, and we'll go straight into a separate tape machine once again. It's just doing the same thing as what the instrument bus is doing, but as this is kind of bypassing the instrument bus, I wanted to make sure that it's also going through the same tape machine. So the exact same settings, same input output, so it's hitting it separately but the same, if that somewhat makes sense, hopefully. So yeah, with it off and then on, it's going to be really subtle, just kind of giving it the same color as the rest of the track. And then we're hitting another gain that's trimming 5 dB of volume, because I think after the Studer and the API, volume compared to the instrument bus was quite loud. So this is one of the cool reasons why I actually keep the orchestra separate from the rest of the band, as it were. It's because, you know, in cases such as this, I can just trim the volume of the orchestra really quickly. I don't have to dig into the string sections on the channels. I don't have to try and balance out how everything's hitting a compressor. I can just keep everything separate. I can set my compressor for the instruments and get it dialed and leave it, and then I can mix in however much or little orchestra I want at any given time. So that's really cool that I was able to sort of balance it out at this stage. And then EQ, this is a mid-only EQ, so it's cutting mids from only the center of the mix, and it's just getting rid of 500 Hertz. It was just way too much because brass is super mid-rangey. I probably have even done some EQ on the brass, I can't remember, but just getting rid of that mid-range, trying to get it out wider. So when you do a mid-cut like this on the mid-only channel, like, it feels like you're pushing everything out wide. So that's why I did that. It was a trick I got from Nolly on his synth processing. I think it was like maybe even the P3 mixing video years ago. But I've kind of stuck with that idea since because I really like what it does when you do a mid-only cut. And Logic users, if you're wondering how you do that, you just go processing down here, and usually default is in stereo. But if you go mid-only, then you can get this sort of effect, and you can do not only that, you can do left, right, and side. So really quickly with that off and then on, it sounds like this. Right, so that's the orchestra bus. Let's just take a quick look at more of the individual pieces of the orchestra, because I wanted the hero of this little section to be the brass. I'd never really had brass as the highlight before in some of my orchestral writing, even when it's in the context of a full band. So what I wanted to do was have them highlighted. So I've got everything going on, bar trumpets, and yeah, let's just take a listen to some of the individual pieces. So I think the main sound that you can all hear is the horns themselves, French horns, and that's from BBC Symphony Orchestra Core. If you're interested in orchestral writing, by the way, I always say this, do check out the Discover version of this plugin. You get the entire orchestra for free from Spitfire's website, and I just think it's an amazing introduction to the world of orchestra. It was my introduction and how I got kind of hooked on the whole thing, and here we are. So yeah, sort of like a really cool way to get into it. So on their own, this is what they sound like. I am using the long couvre articulation, so super brassy, even more so than just the regular longs. Every single piece of the orchestra is going through a single reverb. It's one I found ages ago and I've been using it for my orchestra ever since, and it's just on Space Designer actually. It is the 11.7 second conservatory, just default preset, and I've been using that for ages. So it's like a ridiculously huge reverb. You wouldn't even have to use this, like inside BBC Symphony Orchestra you have reverb in here, but I'm just not using it. You still get a little bit of that room sound in there though, because the samples have been recorded in, I believe the BBC was recorded at Abbey Road, so you get the sound of Abbey Road sort of baked in, which I don't mind. But I like to add even fatter reverb just to give it that depth of scale, like you've just walked off the edge of a cliff and it's like some sort of Elden Ring landscape is just like looking back at you and you're like, whoa. So that was the kind of vibe I was going for. So that's the French horns. Tenor trombones, they sound like this. And what will become clear as we go through this is everything complements each other. Well, that's the goal anyway. So we've heard those two individually. Let's just quickly put them together. brass trombones. Brass trombones? Not brass trombones, we have bass trombones. I must have just mistyped that when I made this template. They're also doing couvre, I think. I think everything is. It's just super brassy sound. And for those unfamiliar with what's going on here, it's modulation and it's dynamics and expression. For those familiar with Spitfire products will know this is your secret weapon. You have to use this stuff if you want somewhat of a more realistic sound from your orchestra. It's sort of like, I mean, yeah, it does what it says on the tin. It's the dynamics and the expression of the players. If you don't touch this, you'll get a very consistent sound, but it's not realistic. Like, especially brass, like I've purposefully left little gaps in there for breaths. And a really fun way to do this is when you're typing in MIDI of brass is to either blow out whilst you're reading it and watching it play. And if you run out of breath, maybe that's a sign that your part is too long for brass players who probably got even better breath work than you anyway. So I like to leave little gaps just in between notes for them to take a breath and then play another set. And as you can see, it's another gap here, another gap here, and then they have a rest after that. And it just keeps it a bit more realistic. I'm fully aware that you might not separate out your different notes on bass trombones anyway. They might just be playing a single note. But this is just what I've done here, and I think it sounds really cool. So this is what the bass trombones sound like. And then we have a tuba. It's just a single player in this library, just one tuba, which is typical of an orchestra. And tuba is your lowest range brass, so it sounds like this. And I have just kept this to single notes because obviously it's only one person playing this part. So yeah. Brass on its own sounds a little bit like this. Fat chords, and that's all happening over that one pedal note, so the guitar's not changing. But yeah, just thought it was a really cool thing to try, like whilst a single guitar is just holding like I think it's just like an open F on the high E string that I decided to like subtly let people know, like, oh yeah, this is in a bit of a weird tuning, like high F. So yeah, that's what the brass is doing. The strings only come in the second time round. So what we've got here, every single string is playing. Every single instrument in the string family is playing. Again, all from BBC SO Core. And these are legatos. So the legatos in Core, I love them personally. I think they're amazing. So you can only ever play one note when it's kind of like a monophonic sound. But what you get with legato, well, really good legato patches, is you'll get like transitions between notes. I forget what it's called, but depending on the dynamics and the expression you play with, you'll get transitions. But you know, first violin part, I mean, it's super simple. Like, it's just going between two notes. So this is what first violins sound like. And then we've got second violins, just playing a single note actually, so really simple stuff. But when you put that together with the first violins, this single note all of a sudden anchors what that first violin is doing. Well, the first violins are doing. Then we've got violas. I believe they're also playing a similar part to the firsts, but probably an octave down. Oh no, it's harmony. Okay, cool. Maybe fifth harmony or something. So those three together should sound quite pretty, quite nice. You've got your cello here playing even lower down. I really wanted to accent this low D sharp or E flat on that last chord, because I wanted the chords to change even though the harmony. So what we've got, not to get too composition heavy here, but what we've got is a major 7 chord. Well, actually just a major chord, just the triad, and then that moves up a semitone higher to the major 7. So what happens is 2 of the notes change, the 5th and the major 3rd change, but that major 7th, well, from the first chord, just the regular note doesn't change, and then it becomes the major 7th of the second chord. If that made no sense, don't worry, it just sounds nice. So that's all I did, you know, I just wanted that vibe. And then the bottom notes actually are the things that change underneath that. So you've got like the pedal note going on, the brass doing the brass thing, and then underneath all of that, you've got the things like the cello and the tuba like changing notes. So you're getting different vibes. I think the most apparent thing that people will probably hear is when it hits that last chord and it's like, whoa, it sounds dark all of a sudden. And that's just because, yeah, it's fun to change notes underneath different harmony. If you can tell I'm enthusiastic about this sort of stuff, I apologize. But yeah, this is what it sounds like anyway. So the 4 of them together. Hopefully everything I just said that probably didn't make much sense and was probably somewhat inaccurate anyway, makes sense in terms of just listening to it. Finally, we've got the double basses. They're just doing probably identical to cello, but an octave lower, probably what I've done. Man, I love double basses. So strings, here we go. Chuck brass and strings together. You don't realize you're hearing the strings when you listen to the song, but when you take them out that second time round, it loses all of that sort of, well, string sound. But I think it also loses like that more cinematic vibe. I know brass is quite cinematic on its own, but without the strings, I do think it's missing a key ingredient. So we'll start with them in, I'll take them out and put them back in. Is still the main sound, right? But the strings are playing more of a supportive role, so it's all like the same notes. And this is the thing with the orchestra. Things can be playing the same parts, if not harmonies of the same chords or inversions, and it all just adds to the wall of sound that you can really get with the orchestra. The woodwinds are doing something different completely. They're playing more of a rhythmic figure that goes along with the guitars. So in the second time round, other clean guitars come in as well, so just take a listen to what they're doing and then we'll dive into the woodwind as well. So just kind of back and forth, different rhythms, sort of like a bit polyrhythmic. but they just sort of talk to the woodwinds. So the woodwinds all together, they're doing this sort of thing that kind of like, yeah, plays off that guitar part that we've got going on. So they really do go together, they fit together kind of like a jigsaw piece. So that's something you can do with orchestra. Like obviously the string and the brass are doing these huge chords, but the woodwinds on their own, they're just quite delicate sounding. I really love that about woodwinds, and I usually will give them parts like this. I say give them as if they're real people. That's how insane I've gotten at this point. But let's just listen to the woodwinds and the guitars, and they kind of talk to each other and just strengthen that rhythmic part. It's not the main thing going on here, but I wanted something that kind of gives a bit more of like a, yeah, like a stereo image interest, not just big chords, you know? Less of an important part, you know, the woodwinds are fairly quiet. They're not the main party piece here, they're just supporting everything. So I believe everything on staccatissimo. Flutes on their own sound like this. And then we've got piccolo as well. I'm just going to add these as we go. Oboes. Clarinets. So that's where you're starting to get that like shifting rhythm between the two parts. And then bassoons, I believe, are playing a mirror of the clarinets but an octave lower. And then what we'll do, we'll quickly move on to tuned percussion because it's just timpani actually. I think it's just one hit and then a roll. Oh, the whole thing is rolls. Interesting, I forgot I did that. Is it? Yeah, okay, cool. So obviously timpanis can do single hits like more typical drum people would do. But you can do rolls on timpani as well, which a lot of you will know the sound of, but can add, again, kind of more of that sort of dramatic vibe. It's cool. Like again, you can play with modulation to soften off the rolls and then lean back into them. So it's all about this push and this pull. I think when you hear the chords, it's not just full on and then off. It's like you're breathing into it and then it's pulling back a bit and then it's pushing again. And I think you can really feel that sense of movement. Well, that's what I wanted to achieve anyway. Maybe that just didn't happen, but that's the goal. So yeah, timpani is just doing big roll. I don't know if this is a realistic part to have like a semitone difference on a timpani, but it's what I've done. So yeah. I think that should hopefully, as you know, you can even visually see it, should paint a pretty accurate representation of how powerful the Spitfire expression and dynamics are. So do use them if you have any Spitfire library. It will transform your arrangements and your compositions. So yeah, they're just doing rolls, just a little bit of low end sort of rumble. Now we've got some fun things here, like we've got some earthquake hits and swells. So the swells are just swells of earthquake hits. So again, if you don't have headphones on for this, you probably won't even hear these things. They're like sub bass. Think, you know, when you boot up Skyrim and it does the three, you know, dum thing. That's probably earthquake hits. Well, earthquake drums anyway. So what we've got here is it's actually not BBC SO, it's an originals library. So whilst it looks a little bit similar, it's an original cinematic percussion. So if you like the sound of this, I think it's 29 quid or dollars or euros. I think it's all the same number. I'm just going to play these on their own. And I think there's some, is there a gong? I think there's a gong in here. Oh, okay, cool. So it's like a roll into a choke. So that's just what the cinematic percussion is doing. Just really kind of, it's just like adding a little bit of like that production vibe to it, you know, it swells, crashes, and then like rises almost. So you can use that sort of stuff like that. Then we've got the choir as well. There's no choir in BBC SO, so once again, I'm using Epic Choir from the originals library. I think I do want to like maybe upgrade the choir sometime in the future, but for now, I mean, it's literally just doing, yeah, like the block chords that I've been outlining. So you're just getting that flavor of the human voice in there as well. Once again, the brass is the main thing. This is just adding to that wall of sound. So first we've got soprano voices, and then I'll play you the tenors. Once again, with voices, you can get away with not having any break in the notes because different people are going to breathe at different times and take a breath to kind of get that endless wave of sound. But I just thought it was a bit easier just to have everyone take a breath. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I did. And then tenor, they sound like this, so it's just lower down. And together they sound like this. So let's add this up. Let's do choir strings and then woodwind, tuned percussion, and then we'll finally add the main thing, the brass, back in, and then that's the whole intro really, bar those 3 guitar parts. And then finally the brass. So after that, what we've got is the main motif, I would say. And once again, I'll probably like to cover all of this like composition stuff in a separate video, but just to outline what the main idea is, it sounds like this, and it's a quad cortex tone, just a compressed clean tone. You could probably get something similar with something like a matchless with a compressor in front and a pretty simple cab and just a bit of reverb. I don't think I've done much else apart from some fairly heavy EQ to make it sound a little bit thinner. So let's go with the EQ off and then on. And yeah, that's the only guitar in there. I really wanted to lean into like single guitar parts in different sections of this song to try and highlight like, well, the whole goal is to try and highlight how cool the guitar is. So from that point, we've got the drums that finally come in, which is weird for me to not have drums straight away. And the drums, well, they sound like this. Let's put in a groove and then you can hear what's happening on the drum bus. And then, well, let's talk about the mix of the individual parts. So I'm not going to lie, this entire mix is actually quite transparent for me. It's not as heavy-handed as some of my previous mixes. Like Escapism was pretty energetic, punchy, and I kind of don't like that mix that I did for that EP anymore. I'm leaning into just clear sounding mixes, like a lot of clarity, no processing that doesn't need to be there. And this song isn't that heavy. Like there's the riff in the middle, but I really like, especially the bass tone and the drums. I'm really, really happy with how it all sort of sits within the mix. A key part of that is the distressor on the drum bus. I'm just going to loop a simple groove in the song and you can hear what it's doing. So first with it off and then with it on. And these settings are similar to Nolly's settings that he had on the Periphery 5 record. And I really liked what the Distressor was doing on that mix that he did. I think it's a very different sound compared to what the Periphery record sounds like, but the settings are very, very similar. I just thought like it was the sort of parallel glue that I was after. So I'm trying out what he did. Just, you know, I find the stuff that Nolly does really inspiring. So I have the dry, it's basically like 75% mix of just dry. Like there's only 25% of the compressed signal in there. The whole compressed signal is just way too much. You can actually mix in how much you want. So yeah, I decided this amount was enough for me. But let me just put it on the whole way and you'll hear just what the Distressor is doing to the drums. So yeah, super pumpy sound. I mean, it's a really good sound. Like the Distressor is pretty iconic. So that's, you know, the main thing that's adding to that sort of glue, and especially the snare is getting clamped. You know, the detector where it's heightened on the mids and it's actually high passing the lows is really key to the sound. You know, like it's looking for the snare drum basically. And you can even see the gain reduction when the snare hits is like between 10 and 12 dB. So yeah, it's really adding to that sort of compressed snare sound. And then obviously this is going on to hit the API on the bus compressor as well. So it's like multiple stages of compression to get that final snare sound. Worth saying, for this entire video, I'm going to keep the instrument bus on now that we've talked about it already, just so, you know, it would stay on whilst I was mixing this thing anyway. So I feel like that's an important thing to keep on, so that, yeah, I know at every single stage that the volumes and the gain staging of my mix, you know, as long as it's hitting the right amount on the API, which I've got this set to, this doesn't really change. Like this goes on all of my mixes. So if things are too loud, I will dial things back at maybe, you know, grouped stages like drums, guitars, basses, and bring everything down or up, you know, depending on if things are too quiet. So that's what my usual gauge is for my mixes personally. Like the volume and the threshold on this doesn't really change, which is probably why I did some gain here, just to reduce the volume of the drums. And yeah, let's move on to what happens after that. We're going into a Neve preamp. It's just doing a little bit of EQ. So 110 Hertz, couple dB boost, and then 1.6K. And then I'm not sure what the EQ is on the high band of the Neve, the 1073. Someone can let me know. But I'm just boosting that a little bit. So it's kind of like a bit of a smile EQ, boosting low and boosting high, and just a little bit of 1.6K. So without it and then with it. And then again, we've just got this sub cut, tiny bit more high end, just after 12K. And yeah, a tiny bit at 65 Hertz, sorry, 62.5 Hertz. That'll just be, a tiny bit of just, again, super low end on the kick hit, just to bring it out a tiny bit more. Awesome, so that's a drum bus. So every single piece of the drums is going through that. And then once again, from that drum bus, it's getting fed straight into the instrument bus. So that's the sort of structure that I'm looking at in this session. Let's talk about what I've got going on the kick. Not too much actually, a bit of EQ, tape machine, compression. That's it. But the EQ is doing a lot. So this is actually really similar to the kick mix that I've done on some of my demo, especially like the weekly composes series that I've been recently doing. So I'm going to start with everything off and slowly add everything back in from top to bottom. So this is what the kick sounds like. Super organic kick, kind of a transparent sound. You can kind of mold it to whatever you want it to be really. So this first EQ is pretty large. So this is going to make a ginormous difference to the kick sound, especially the high end. This is basically the biggest move in this entire thing, and it's gonna turn it from like a regular nice kick to a clicky metal kick. Cutting a lot of this out around 170 hertz, cutting 9 dB. So yeah, with it off and then on, and you'll hear the difference. Okay, so obviously it's adding a load of high end. I'm just gonna take all of that out. I think the key move here, like adding high end for sure, yeah. But the key move here, I think, that I discovered a while ago, it was when I was mixing the Periphery 4 kick, and it's something I've brought along with me to mixing the P5 kick. If you actually do a cut just above like the resonant peak of the kick drum, which is about 60 hertz, rather than boosting 60 hertz, if you cut just above that, it gives like the auditory illusion that you're adding bass. I actually watched a video about this. I forgot the video, which is not good. I watched a video about this, and it's sort of what Pultec EQs do as well. When you actually cut like around the EQ you want to boost, it gives the impression that you're actually boosting the EQ. So you can kind of do reductive EQ moves, but get the impression that you're boosting the signal. It's so weird. But also there's some like stuff going on around here anyway that I wanted to cut. So it's just kind of like two birds, one stone. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with it here and then take it back down to 9 dB. Two things I want you to listen for is obviously the low end giving the impression that the 60 hertz range, like the heart of the kick, is getting boosted, but we're also making the kick itself a lot tighter. So there's not this like woofy sort of like, yeah, 200, 150 hertz stuff going on. So yeah, enough of me talking, let's have a listen to it. Hopefully you can hear the difference. Like, in my opinion, that move is night and day. Like for me personally, what I like to hear in a kick. And then you can just, like even that move, the kick sounds good, but adding in the rest of the high end, it just makes it like brighter, right? So you're just taking the foundation and adding some brightness. So that's the first EQ. The second one is adding a load of mid-range. I felt like the kick was a little bit hollow sounding, so I added some mids going on here around 800. And there was some weird stuff going on, maybe around 1.1K, so obviously I've cut them out. So without it and then with it. Yeah, so those tiny little changes there, just probably some like strange resonances. You could kind of hear them there. And then we're going through my favorite tape machine for all low end things, bass, like bass kick drum, like that sort of stuff. Oxide tape machine from UA. This thing is a little powerhouse. Essentially, I don't even have it on the 15 IPS mode. I've only got it on 7.5. I'm boosting the high end EQ again and boosting the input, trimming the output. Only thing I wish this plugin had was like an auto gain feature. So as you boost the input, the output comes down. So you're not having a level difference. But as long as you mirror these, like whichever way you go, if you took the input down, boost the output, whichever way you push them, just make sure that they're mirrored. So you're not getting an impression of a volume boost. But again, just listen to the high end, and it's probably boosting a little bit more low end as well. I usually have this on 15 IPS on kick drums, but I think this has got enough low end in it anyway. So without it and then with it. Finally, we've got a compressor. I'm using the Manley here, and I hadn't used this compressor on kick before. but I found this preset called Kick Joy. I think it's in italics because I've made some changes. So if you have this in your Spark collection, find the Kick Joy preset, and then if there's something different going on, then I suppose you can just copy the settings I've got. But yeah, so essentially what's happening here is I'm just clamping down on a little bit of it. It's not doing too much, but just adds that little bit of like slappy glue that I guess I was after with a compressor. So with it off and then on, it sounds like this. So the entire signal's coming through. I don't usually do that where, you know, I usually have like 70-80% of the wet signal and like 20% dry. But with this preset, I just thought it sounded amazing. So I don't even think I changed that much. Again, yeah, Kick Joy in the Manly compressor in the UA Spark collection. I think it's worked a treat on the kick, and that is the kick drum. Next we've got the snare, and oh my god. I forgot I did this many plugins on the snare. Okay, I'm gonna leave the two gains on. They're just doing, for some reason, a 15 and a 1 separately, dB gain reduction. And then we've got all of this going on as well. So let's just hear the raw snare and then let's go from there. So what I'm doing here is I'm summing the top and bot snare, and the bottom snare has just got a bit of EQ on it, just to shape up a little bit of that high end. The top snare's got nothing on it. So the bottom here is, yeah, just a small cut 500 and then a small boost at 5.6K. So this is what this is doing to the bottom snare. And then both of those are going into the snare bus, which is then hitting the drum bus. First up is a Neve preamp, and this actually isn't doing anything EQ wise, it's just the coloration of the preamp, which I guess technically is a post amp because it's a plugin after the fact, but that doesn't matter. I'm just using it for the coloration of what the Neve would sort of do. Let's not get into that. So what that is doing is just adding that sort of Neve sound. So really subtle, it's probably not doing that much. So yeah, with it off and then on. And then we're going straight into the oxide again. This time I am using 15 IPS mode as well as the CCIR EQ, which just boosts a bit more high end. So yeah, the snare's going straight into this. We'll probably add a lot more color to the sound than the Neve. So yeah, firstly Neve, then the tape machine, and then it's going to hit a couple EQs, and then a compressor and some more EQ, it looks like, because I didn't do enough. So yeah, this is what the oxide sounds like. You can see how it just like brings to life the high end, and obviously the low end too, but I think the high end is what you can really hear there, like the crack of the snare. Yeah, and then we're going straight into an EQ, and this looks to me like we're boosting, you know, a good amount of, you know, the 200 hertz, like the body of the drum, and cutting a bit of mids and then boosting even more highs. So initially with it off, and then I'll put it on, and then we'll talk about like the moves that I've done. Cool, so I can already hear why I needed a second EQ. I wonder if you've heard it too. This is the only thing with that, you know, with the Logic stock EQ, I probably need to buy an EQ, don't I? It's just one of those things that you end up putting off. You can only have 4 parametric EQs, so you kind of have to make do with big moves and then adding another instance of channel EQ. But yeah, as you can hear, it's scooping the sound, boosting the low end, boosting a bit more brightness. And the next EQ is going to, yeah, I thought I would do this, is just really small Q cuts. Biggest one being this one at 300 Hertz. If you could already hear it, I definitely could. It's just like, it's naturally going to happen. You know, your resonant peak is around 200 Hertz of the body of the drum. So it makes sense that one of the harmonic overtones is going to be at 300 Hertz, and you can definitely hear that. So just listen for this sort of EQ around 300 Hertz and it'll be really obvious why I decided to remove it. You probably don't have to, but I just kept hearing it, so I got rid of it. So yeah, with it like completely off, and then I'll boost it and then reduce it. Yeah, necessary in my opinion, just to tame it down a little bit. You can still hear it, like it's not gone. Like I still want the harmonic overtones in the snare to be there. I don't just want to kill the snare, because you can just start notching out all of these little rings and pops that you might have in the snare drum, but at a certain point you're killing the character of what the nature of the instrument is. Just reduce the parts that like might be a bit obtrusive. Try and live with the fact that, like, you know, if it's been recorded well, engineered well, which, my God, all of these samples sound incredible anyway, you don't really have to do too much work to them to get them sat properly. Obviously, there's something going on at 1.1K, which I was not happy with, and I can't remember what that is. So let's turn them off and maybe I can hear it. Yeah, I can just about hear it. Just a slight whistle on some of the samples. So I decided to get rid of it. It's just kind of like a really weird ring. So they're both on the exact same EQ. So I really didn't want 1.1K in the snare drum at all, apparently. And then we've just done a little bit more high end, probably to try and attenuate for me getting rid of this little ring. So yeah, that's the second EQ. Then we're into, you know, classic 1176. What I'm doing here is actually really interesting. I'm using it on one of the secret modes that's probably not so secret anymore. So all the buttons are pressed in on the ratio, which kind of unlocks the final boss of the 1176, which is this super smashed sound. And I clearly liked it, so without it and then with it, and you'll be able to hear the difference. Obviously compressing the snare a lot, but I think it's just, you know, lengthening that transient decay and giving it more of like a squashed feel. So I often find that I do this with the 1176. Like, the normal ratio modes are cool, but I have found myself doing this a lot. And if you do have this plugin and you're not sure how to do this, just, if it's usually like this, right? If you just hold shift on your keyboard, then you can have any one of the 4 secret modes, well, 3 secret modes. So the more you press, yeah, you can get those, which is kind of cool actually, because that is something that was on the real unit. So I'm glad that they included it here. So yeah, on the all buttons in mode, I would say. And then we're into the Century Tube channel strip for more EQ. I don't usually use this plugin anymore on my snares, but I was at the time. And I'm just using more EQ. Like I said, there wasn't enough, and I needed to boost more low end, more mids, and more highs. So yeah, with it off and then on. Cool, and then the final thing is a transient master, and this is just purely removing some of that spiky attack right at the start of the snare drum. It's not doing much, like 20% reduction on the attack, and I think it just sits in the mix better once we listen to the mix as a whole. So with it off and then on, and then yeah, just listen for that immediate attack. The rest of the drum is going to sound the same, but just that initial, 5 milliseconds of the transient. Cool, so the last thing on the snare is just a little bit of reverb, and it's just adding a small amount of, like you would say, like there's room mics already included with the drums, but just affecting the snare, you'll hear what it is adding. So with it off, and then I will add it, and you'll be able to hear it's just a little bit of vibe. So yeah, not doing too much, and then the actual reverb itself, which is chroma-verb, is just going into this EQ, just removing basically like all of the low end, a little bit of 500 hertz, and again, just trying to bring out a little bit more brightness in that snare. So that's what's going on there, and that's the snare. Cool, so then we've got the toms, and these are individually mixed and then just going into a toms bus. So let's just listen to the rack tom. So it's just 3 things on these. Pretty standard tom metal EQ, where you're just cutting a load of the mids, boosting the high end. So without it. So yeah, it's just cutting out a lot of that mid-range that just isn't hugely needed for a mix like this. And then they're all hitting the 176, which is actually like the predecessors to the 1176. It's got a bit more sass and a little bit more vibe to it, in my opinion. I think the 1176 is a bit more of like a little bit more of a transparent compressor. But yeah, this is just hitting a little bit. It's not too compressed on the toms, and this is what it sounds like. And then finally, once again, my favorite tape machine for individual instruments, the Oxide. And this, again, boosting low, boosting high, nothing being pushed on the input. So it should be, hitting levels pretty decently. So let's have a look with it off and then on. So essentially the rack and the floor tom have got near identical EQs. So like they're really similar, they're all doing a similar vibe, but just slightly different EQs based on what's, the particular tom that's happening here. Then they're all hitting the same 176, same settings, and going through the same settings on the Oxide. So all together they sound like this. I'm just cutting a bit of low end, on the tom bus itself. I felt like, all in it was a bit too heavy handed. So, with it off, it sounds like this. And then with it on, it just helps tame, like, especially that low end rumble of the floors. And it's actually going to the snare EQ as well. So with it off, you actually lose a lot of high end. I really liked like sending a bit of the toms to the reverb. Actually added like a lot of the attack. With it off, and then with it on, I just really like what that's doing to the toms. And once again, yeah, straight to the drum bus, and then from there straight to the instrument bus. All right, next up is the overheads, which is nearly all of the spot mics and the overheads getting summed into a single bus, which is the cymbal bus, and once again going straight to the drum bus from there, and then the instrument bus at the end. So let me take everything off. I'll leave the gain on once again because I'm trimming a lot of volume here. So with nothing on and just going straight into the drum bus, sounds like this. So the first EQ is doing something that I'm doing a bit less these days, but I feel like in this mix it helped the overheads a lot, which is to do a sort of Pultec style move, is to boost super high and then cut just above and below it to really accentuate just that little segment of the frequency spectrum. So what I've done is taking this huge the actual numbers of what's happening here look insane, but because of everything else that's being pulled in the opposite direction, you can kind of see that whilst we've got like a bit of a cut at 6 and 8K and a smaller one at 2.6, obviously the heavy lifter is this 9K shelf that's being pulled up by 20 dBs, and obviously we're cutting out, let's not forget, 200 hertz, 12 dB per octave cut on the low end. So we're filtering out nearly all of the bass, maybe a bit of the snare as well, a bit of the body of the snare, just because obviously that's handled mostly by the close mics from the kick and snare anyway. So yeah, I'll start with it off, put it on, and then you'll hear a load of brightness, hopefully. So the second EQ, oh, that's interesting. So I must have heard something at 1.5K. So it's just a little notch at 1.5K. So I must have heard something whistly here. I think it might be from the mini ride. Yeah, I think it's from the mini ride. Just a tiny little bit of a resonant peak from that mini ride, which I do think sounds great. So yeah, just reducing that there. So then we're going into smash and grab actually. And this is on a low mix percentage, like 30%, yeah, about there. Trying to glue some of the cymbal hits together and give it more of like melded sound. And I do really, really like what it is doing, especially on the smash mode. And yeah, I think you'll be able to hear the difference. It is definitely compression, what is happening to the overheads. But again, with only 30% of the wet signal coming through, it's just like, yeah, trying to blend some of the decays for the cymbals to try and just get them to glue together a bit better. So with it off first and then with it on. Finally, one of my favorite plugins, Soothe 2. Just Nolly's default preset on this, cymbal smooth, to smooth the cymbals. And yeah, I'll always recommend Soothe 2. If you've never tried it, get the free trial, see if you like it. I liked it a lot, so I decided to buy it and I haven't looked back since. And I just think it really, really helps. It's a really powerful plugin actually. I need to use it more. But I like to use it to tame like extraneous frequencies, like from cymbals. Sometimes I use it on bass and guitar. Sometimes I've used it on the entire mix as well, but you've got to be careful in that regard. But on the cymbals, I'm just removing a tiny amount. So by clicking delta, you'll be able to hear what it's removing. But first, I'll start with it bypassed, then put it in, and then you will listen to the delta as well. It just feels like some shimmery butter has just been spread over the top. I don't know how else to describe it. I just think it works. And that's the cymbals. Okay, so the room, mostly snare going through this, a little bit of cymbals, and because we're compressing as well, you get a bit more heightened energy from the cymbals. So the first thing it's hitting is another instance of smash and grab in the smash mode on the room default sound. And yeah, this is what it's doing. So with it off first. Cool. So just adding a ton of attack and extending out the decay as well a fair amount. Don't always compress my rooms these days, but when I did, I actually, the more I think about this, I actually did this mix a fair while ago. So there's some things in this mix, if I could remix this track, you know, I'd probably do ever so slightly differently. But look, you know, this is probably a snapshot of where my head and my ears were at maybe 6 months ago. And the fact that I would do stuff differently already is, I mean, it's not a bad thing. It's just a sign that you know, we're all continuing to grow and learn new things, and I would do things differently, and it's no bad thing. So yeah, anyway, philosophy lesson aside, next up we've got one EQ, just cutting some low end, a little bit of that boxy snare sound, you can probably hear it already, and a little bit of that cymbal shimmer. We just don't really need it that much. And that's just a result of compressing your room. Again, might not compress the room mic in the future, like I wouldn't probably do it now, but in this instance that's what I did. So yeah, with it off and then on. And then we've got a similar EQ. It's probably, yeah, this is just me, probably late at night, doing more EQ. Probably just because I'm trying to get the room sat properly in the mix. And this is probably something I've done whilst everything's playing, which is what I would actually recommend. I know that we're going through this in solo, but probably should have said this earlier. I'd actually recommend mixing most of this stuff whilst you're hearing the entire mix. It's not much use mixing a room on its own, but for the purposes of this video, so that you can hear individual steps, that is what we're doing here. But I imagine, yeah, I've added another EQ because in the context of the mix, this is the sort of stuff that can happen when you're fighting against your own ears at a certain point. So again, I would go back and change this, but this is the mix, and it just goes to show, look, like, you know, you don't have to release perfectly mixed music. You know, I was really happy with the mix at the time. I still am. I still think it sounds great, but it's just, there's quirks in there, right? Like, I don't remember doing this, but obviously I did. So look, it is what it is. Let's listen to this soloed first, and then I'll put it in, and then let's actually see if it's made a difference in the mix. Wow, yeah, so it's really changing the sound of that snare. It's really hollowing it out and adding a lot more high end. I think I actually like it with it off, but let's see what it does in the mix. Let's just do the drums first and then see. See, it makes a bit more sense in the context of the drum mix, and then in context of the entire instrument bus, we'll start with it off again. I get it, like, I think it just makes the room sound a bit more hi-fi. If I was to mix this again, I would do more room sound and probably more compression on the drums as a whole. But I do think, yeah, for what it's worth, I think it sounds good. And lastly, the room is just going through more of the snare reverb. So once again, the room soloed, no reverb, and then I'll add it in. Yeah, I think you can hear, like, it's just filling out the void a little bit, trying to extend that snare. transient and make the decay artificially a little bit longer. I think it does a good job of that. And we'll take one last listen to the drum bus again, and then we'll move on to the bass. Okay, awesome. So that's probably like the majority of the mix is always the drums. So let's talk about the bass. Let's start chronologically and go from there. So the first bass you hear is this light gain. The entire track is my Bowden Prog 5 bass. I believe the entire track is both pickups. A blend of, just an even blend, which is not something I used to do. I used to track with the bridge pickup only, and I thought I'd try a blend of the pickups, I believe, if I can remember correctly. I think that's what I did. So the first thing you hear is when the groove comes in and the bass, well, let's just take a listen to it first and then we'll listen to the DI, and you can see sort of what I've, come up with and see if you like it. Awesome. So once again, I'm just going to leave the gain in because it's doing minus 31 dB, which is cool. So let's start from the DI. Awesome. So it's already a really nice sounding DI. I think it was brand new strings probably for the whole recording of the bass. Sounds quite bright, quite zingy. I think I always say zingy to describe this bass. It's just a word that comes to mind. Yeah, and then it's going straight into another instance of distressor. So I use the distressor quite a lot on this mix. So this is acting as like, you've gone straight through your interface with your DI. First thing it's hitting is a bit of compression to give it a volume lift and a bit of harmonic saturation, like not saturation per se, but just a bit of excitement around these harmonic overtones to try and, before it hits any compression, it's already getting a bit of a lift. So this is what the distressor is doing to the DI. And as you can hear, I'm using a pick. I've been playing with my fingers more and more. 4 sections like this. I think, as you can see, further along it says main clean brackets use fingers. So I think I did for this section here. So it's the same tone. So let's listen to what my fingers sound like. Massive difference. So if you're out there, bassist or not, there is a huge difference to finger and pick tone. You can hear how like plappy it sounds. Plappy is probably not the right word. You can hear like I'm playing it in a very specific way. Like I'm really coming down on the strings, not with a lot of like velocity or strength, but enough to sort of push the string into the fret so that it clacks against it and you get this really nice sort of naturally high-end hi-fi sound from the bass. And yeah, the bass sounds really modern anyway, and I'm using just normal D'Addario nickel strings, so not stainless steel or anything insanely bright, but certainly not round wounds, just normal, pretty typically prog metal bass strings. I just thought it was cool to highlight the difference. So let's carry on with the picked tone, because I think I dialed it for the pick specifically, and then we'll go back and listen to how different the fingers sound in that first verse. So yeah, next up is Parallax, and I'm using one of my typical presets. I'm going through a custom IR and the 906, the microphone, in Parallax. So it's actually a blend of Parallax's regular IR collection and one of my own. So if you didn't have any custom IRs, I'd recommend the 906 in Parallax X for sure. It's my favorite IR sound in Parallax. And what's happening here is full compression on the low end, quite a low pass, around 111 Hertz. Well, I say around, it is. And then that's really high on the level. And mid distortion's literally like nothing at all. I just want that clack that comes from the mid distortion in Parallax. High distortion, I use a bit more versatile. You can see the high actually spills over to the mid band quite a lot, and a lot more in terms of actual gain. And that's bringing more of the filling out sound that you're getting from this, and a little bit of EQ first. So let's just listen to what Parallax is doing, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything off and add it in one by one. And just a note again, Parallax only sends mid and high to the IRs, so the low end is just not getting any IR on it at all. So let's turn it on and you can see what it sounds like. So firstly, let's just turn the EQ off. So just cutting a little bit, that 250 sort of, I wouldn't say boxy, but I'd say boxy for bass. And yeah, let's just listen to what the low is doing on its own. And then the mids, you'll hear how clacky this sounds. So you've got to be really careful with how much mids you add into the bass tone itself. And then together, so that's the majority of the sound, I would say. But when you add in the high distortion, I think it fills it out quite nicely. Awesome. And then we're going into an API channel strip, and it's the Vision channel strip. And what this is doing, I'm not using much of the stuff in here. I'm not using the filter. I am using the compressor a little bit, but mostly what I'm doing here is a bit of EQ. So on the high frequency, nothing's happening. Then we've got 1.5K with a 2 dB boost. And then we've got low mids are also doing nothing. And then what we've got on the low frequencies is we've got 100 Hertz boost by 2 dB. So a little bit of high, a little bit of low, just to kind of get a bit more excitement there. So I'll start with it off and just put it on and you'll hear what it's doing. Yeah, you can see I'm hitting the compressor a tiny amount. I think it just helps even out my playing. I've tried to be pretty good with how evenly I've played this. You know, it's not perfect, but I've tried my best and I think it looks pretty good as a DI. And then what we're hitting is a bit more EQ. Just once again to liven up the high end. I think it's quite a dark sounding tone so far. And especially in the context of the mix. So if I just put this into the whole mix now, I think you'll just completely lose the distorted part of the bass tone. So that's why I've EQ'd these, you know, extra parameters in there, and I've tried to boost especially 800 and 1K and give it a little bit of that, like, you know, higher mid frequencies, and then once I add those in, I think you'll be able to hear the distortion. But in the mix, I can guarantee you just lose that high end. Yeah, it just doesn't sound like full at all. It just, you can hear that there's like bass presence. So let's go back to mixing in solo of what I've done, and let's just add both of these EQs in at the same time. You can see how it's just come alive, right? The whole tone has just opened up, and it's important to know, like, yeah, it looks like I've added a lot of high end to already a pretty zingy bass part, but in the context of the mix, it might still just disappear. So I like to hear the distortion in the overtone, even when it's it's not that distorted, it's not like fuzzed out or anything. I like to hear the overtones in the context of the entire mix. So what we're hitting after that is double tap, and this is just a 2-stage compressor from the fine people at Submission Audio. And what this does is really clamps down a little bit more on the low end, and then it gets sent through a bit of saturation, and then it hits the all compressor. So the cool thing double tap is doing is just controlling a bit of the low end. So I'm actually reducing the level of low end here and boosting the overall signal. So I guess the impression you get is the mid and the high bands are increasing in volume. So yeah, let's start with it off and then I'll add it in. Yeah, so I think it's giving it a slight volume boost. I think it did need it. And in context of the entire mix now, I think you'll be able to hear the bass a lot better. Yeah, those EQs, man, they just really open up the top end of that bass. And for curiosity's sake, let's just listen to the pick tone once more and then the finger tone. And yeah, you'll hear the difference. So the main tone of the song is this main gain track, and this is basically exactly the same apart from parallax. So I won't go through the individual steps here. All I'm going to talk about is this parallax preset. So now what we've got is similar sort of vibe. I think it's the same EQ actually. It's the same IR, so that's important. If you're going to do different bass tones, I'd recommend keeping the same IRs, so I've still got mine and a blend of the 906 from Parallax. And the biggest difference here is the fact that we've got more mid distortion, and way more level of high distortion actually. So what this sounds like, I'll just get rid of everything really quickly, so you can just hear just the distressor and Parallax, and then I'll add everything back in. Yeah, so that high distortion's really pulling its weight in this tone. So it's a similar vibe, you know, it's exactly the same sort of playing style to the first half of the intro. But because it's much more, you know, it's held notes, there's no staccato playing in here, it's just all ringing out, trying to lock in with the kick drum. And I think it just gives this impression of the entire mix opening up a little bit. And then once we add in the rest of it as well, I think you'll hear, yeah, it just comes alive. And in the context of the mix, it sounds like this. So it's not really something you immediately notice, but you can hear when I take it out just how loud the bass is, and I think it really helps solidify the sound of the intro. And we're straight into our third bass tone. We've already covered this one here because it's kind of the same tone as the very first part of bass that we do here. And this is actually really different. It's actually more of a clean tone, again, using fingers. So if I'm not wrong, I think this is a copy-pasted take because everything stays the same, it just gets a little bit heavier. So don't be afraid to do that in your own writing. So what we've got here is the same performance, but it's going through the dark glass pedal instead. I'm not using the cab here either, so or the distortion, so it's just a little bit of flavor on the EQ. So with it off, let me just turn the channel EQ and double tap off as well. What we've got is this sort of sound. And then with it on, so yeah, it's just adding a little bit of color to the DI. Like the DI, you could probably get away with just using the DI in this mix and you'd probably be like, yeah, that just works. But I wanted to shape its tone a little bit. I definitely wanted to control some of the mid-range, or low mid-range, and especially like this 4.5K sort of clacky region that we've got going on. So without the EQ, and then I'll add it in. Yeah, just controlling more of the mid-range than the high end, to be honest. And then once again, I think this is even the same sort of vibe of what double tap is doing to the bass. Main thing is we're not using grunt saturation anymore. We're using the glue. Yeah, again, a little bit of low compression, a little bit of all compression, just to try and slam this a little bit more because my finger playing is not as consistent as my pick playing, but I've tried to get it as close as possible. It's a lot more difficult, well, in my opinion. I've not played bass with fingers as much as pick, so I tend to struggle a lot more, but that's why we have compression. So yeah, sounds like this. Yeah, just add in a load of low end, even though it's not even doing that much. It's just sort of the flavor of like the glue as well as like what the bands are affecting. I feel like it fills out the bass really nicely. And in the context of the mix, super happy with this bass sound. Okay, cool. So rhythm guitars. Well, let's start with the rhythms, and I'm gonna focus firstly on just the chorus the first time through, and I'll explain some of the tones and, to be honest, just how little processing I'm actually doing to the guitars. There's a lot of them in terms of the rhythms, doing different sections and different parts. So I'll touch on a few of the sounds that we've got going on, but a lot of it is printed audio straight from the quad cortex. So for example, the main sound in nearly all of the rhythms, bar the two archetype Rabia tracks right at the top here, is the Kraken, the Victory Kraken, and it's the model from the quad cortex. So if you're interested in this tone, then you can head to my Cortex Cloud and grab the newest preset that I just put up there called A Call Beyond 2024. And this is Cortex Control, so this is basically what the quad is seeing as well. So in here, what we've got is 8 really usable presets. So we've got a precision drive rhythm, which is my captured precision drive into the Kraken. And we've also got a clon rhythm, which is using a capture of a clon centaur instead of a precision drive for a bit more of a saturated and squidgy sound. And this is the tone that I use nearly, like on all of these rhythms here for the chorus and for the post-chorus as well as the outro. For the lead and lead no boost, I use a good amount of that too. But once we get into the leads, I'll show you what I've done there. But for the rhythms, it's mostly the clon rhythm. The clean tone again is slightly different. It's based on just a really compressed clean amp. I can't remember the exact amp, but again, it's from the Quad, and just really mid-rangey and squidgy. And I'll show you the clean guitars once I get there as well. But for now, let's just take a listen to the Kraken left and right. And this is the chorus riff. So this is going on underneath the lead melody. Awesome, so sounds really cool. I really liked the sound of the Kraken for this particular song, and yeah, so straight up going into a multi-band compressor. Only thing it's really doing is between 85 and 180 hertz. We've got this super tight band that's just pushing down, just trying to get those palm mutes, like the bass like influx that you get when you do palm mutes on like heavily overdriven sounds. If I play a little bit, you'll see it just wants to clamp down like just on palm mutes, and this is the left, this is the right, so basically doing the same thing. And then if I take these off and listen to those two palm mutes, you'll hear how much bass is just coming through. So yeah, they're just quite a functional, they're not really coloring the sound, they're just taming that low end. It's better than doing a flat EQ that's just cutting out that sort of like band. I think it's better to just clamp down when it exceeds that threshold, which is, you know, hopefully only on palm mutes. So both of them are going through that. Both of them are going through the same gain, so just volume trim. And then both of them are going through this EQ just to cut some mid-range. So this is the left, this is the right, and once again, I'll turn it off and then put them back on. Yeah, to be honest, it's a small move. It just helps clean it up a little bit. I think there's enough mid-range in that tone already. So once it's going through the instrument bus, which it already is, I felt like there was just a bit too much going in. So I just reduced at the channel stage, just so when it hits the EQ, hits the compressor that's kind of saturating the mids, it isn't too like boxy sounding. And then all those are doing is going to this rhythms bus, and what's on here is just more EQ. And this is affecting every single rhythm guitar. So all we've got here is a bit more of a scooped cut at 300 and just a bit more hair on it as well. So this has been on for this whole time. So I'm just going to turn that off now and you can hear what it's been doing. Awesome. So yeah, just shaping the tone just a little bit, just to help it sit in the mix a little bit better. And that's something that I would normally do with the guitars in the full mix. So just so you can hear those two in the mix. And you're probably wondering, what are these two doing then? If that's like already a pretty fat sound, what is the two archetype Rabea instances doing? Well, this is something I've been doing for a little while. I've been running this super messed up tone that has got, it has no cab on it in Rabea. It's actually going through to Get Good Drums Cali cab, and it has the exact same cab as my Quad Cortex preset. So what I've done for this song is I used this particular IR for the entire track, But on the actual preset available for download, you'll notice that I've approximated a really close sounding cab that I really like the sound of anyway. Just using a 57, same thing, you know, same thing right here on the Kali cab. And that's just because when you download that, and if I'd have kept that old IR in there, then you'd have no IR on your preset. So that's just a slight change in tone, but it was just what I was rocking for this particular mix. So I wanted to keep that consistent with the beer guitars as well. So yeah, they're kind of bypassing the cab in the archetype and going straight into, yeah, I mean, and literally the default sound on the Kali cab is my favorite sound. So yeah, that's all this is. You literally open it up and that's it. Yeah, so this sounds a bit messed up on purpose, hence the name. Super fuzzed out. What it is, it's actually, you know, I just love the way that Beer's plugin does this. I think he's, honestly, more and more he's got some of my favorite tones on the go, and I really find myself drawn towards these three pedals and how they act mostly in relationship with each other, and especially in front of the Kraken first channel. I just feel like what they do is just so unique. Like, I think there's a couple fuzzes in other archetypes now, but this particular fuzz and this particular octaver, I personally think they're just untouchable. Don't know why, they've just got something going on. So yeah, I'm just gonna take the three pedals off. I'm just gonna chuck this in the middle so you can hear without one of your ears getting blasted. And yeah, I'll slowly introduce them. See, that's not a normal octaver. Like, that sounds so cool. Like, it's in the vintage mode, which I think is giving it a lot of sass. If I put it in the modern mode, you'll get a much more like clean, precise, accurate, clinical octave sound. You just hear how much like sass it's got going on, especially in the high end. It sounds quite like screechy, but like in a really cool way. I don't know how to describe it. And then that's, you know, it's only just getting started. We're going into the fuzz in the modern mode. So I'm going to take the octaver off so you can just hear what the fuzz is doing. I mean, sounds like a fuzz. Sounds great. It's also going into the overdrive, and that's doing this. So that's just doing more of a typical sort of like tightening up everything sound. Put all three together. Just sounds monumental, I think that's the word. Yeah, going into the multipressor again. Again, that's just taming some of that like boomy frequency that you can get in guitars, and just into a gain, which is actually boosting. So this time I felt like they were a little bit quiet and just boosted the volume a tiny bit. Let's put that together with the other two guitars. I'll take them out, add them back in. They are playing different parts. So with this sort of sound, I don't typically play the same guitar part as the other two guitars on that like super tight modern sound. What I usually do is, most part, I double what the bass is doing. So the bass is doing much more static eighth notes, just holding down whatever chord we're on. And these two basically do the same thing. So you get this like widening of the bass underneath the two like more like acrobatic and clinical sounding guitars. So they're doing all the notes. This is holding down the bass at the sides of the mix. And and then in the middle is the actual bass, which I'll add in afterwards so you can really hear how this is all talking to each other. So yeah, they're the two beers. Let's add in the two guitars first, and then I'm gonna add in the beers, and you'll hear like, I mean, I love how it sounds, so yeah. So in context, the messed up guitars are actually quite quiet. It's not taking away from the intricacies of the performance in the main tone, but it's underpinning everything with this foundational sort of quality. So what you get is this, like, you know, you've not got like this skyscraper that's like trying to topple over because there's no bottom end to the tone. So because we've taken away a decent amount with palm mutes and stuff, and we've scooped out a little bit of that 300 hertz, this sort of fills it out, but it's just a completely different and more of a unique quality compared to just quad tracked 5150s, for example. So let's just add the bass in, even though we've already covered the bass tone. This is just on the main gain tone, just playing root notes, same as the beer performances, and yeah, sounds pretty massive. So for the most part, this Kraken tone is handling, yeah, most of these rhythms. So again, this is just Kraken left and right. So that's the second time that we hear that sort of motif. The first time you hear it is actually a really different tone. So when it initially comes in, we have this sound instead. So yeah, that's more of like a compositional thing I decided to do, so I will definitely cover that in the composition video when I get around to filming that. But yeah, the second time that it comes back after the post-chorus, I just felt like going back to the clean sound after that big of a chorus just didn't work. So we stayed with the rhythms on that sort of juicy, and that is the clon for sure, that sort of clon rhythm, that squishy, saturated sound. Really love it here. I started playing around with it and I was just like, yeah, that's the sound that I need. Let's just listen to what the rhythms are doing in this post-chorus riff. I'll take them out and put them back in. And I'll play a few more sections of this tone, similar sort of tone here. So yeah, that's honestly most of the rhythm guitars, all based on that sort of Kraken sound, and yeah, going straight into the instrument bus from there. And what we've got next is all of the lead guitars. So the first lead guitar that you really hear is in the first verse, and just worth noting, there's absolutely no processing on the bus itself. So we're just doing some processing on individual tracks here. It's just easier to file them in one sort of thing. So if I want lead guitars muted, then I just have to press one button. So yeah. So this first lead tone is Archetype Rabea, and it is an octave sort of fuzzed out tone, but it's nowhere near as messed up as those rhythms that we were just listening to. So it sounds like this. And you'll be thinking, wait, why? It doesn't end there, it carries on. Well, what I decided to do was on the second half have more gain. So I could have probably automated the gain to increase, but for some reason I just thought it was a bit easier to keep these things separate. So yeah, it goes from this sort of sound to, it's the same sound, just but a little bit more juice. And you'll notice here we've got two left and right octave double leads, and they're also on the same sort of tone, and they just accent this little like melody segment that I was quoting in the first half, but now we're an octave higher, I'm just quoting again. And that's that first verse melody tone. So the next lead that we're going to hear is the chorus, and this is a quad printed tone. And what I did was I used the lead preset in here, but I turned off the delay and the reverb. So I still sort of tracked the actual tone, but I'm using archetype bassy for the delay and the reverb in the box, just in case I wanted to control that. So sometimes that's what I do for my lead tones. I'll actually track everything tone wise, but modulation I might do afterwards in case there's tempo changes in the project, or I want to mute the reverb for a phrase. It's just easier to do that after the fact, which makes total sense to me. So that's what I did in this case. So the Kraken lead sounds like this. Again, it's the klon in front of the Kraken. So this first EQ is just doing a little bit of tone shaping. It's already a pretty juicy mid-rangey tone. Just a tiny bit more high end. I think I just wanted it to sing a little bit more above how dense the chorus is. You can hear me change pickups there. We go to the neck pickup. Apologies for the playing, but I tried my best. So again, I'm actually doing a bit more multi-band compression here. Oh, just a tiny bit on that sweep, so really not doing much. I think it's just a safety precaution, to be honest. And then, of course, delay and reverb from archetype of bassy. I really like the delay and reverb from this archetype. And I mean, yeah, it's pretty default settings, nothing special. But what is special is the sound of these two pedals from this plugin. I just really love them, especially the reverb. Okay, cool, so the lead guitar in context sounds a little bit like this. So it just about sits above the rest of the mix, and there's a tiny little harmony here that's doing just not enough gate, but that's fine, you won't hear that in the mix. Yeah, cool, and I think we've got something similar here with two harmonies. Yeah. Cool, so that's the lead guitar for the chorus. The next melody that we really have is this solo that I did on a bit of a funny tone for me. So I used archetype Rabia, and what this solo is, it's again going through the GGD Cali Cab Studio, and what is happening here is I've got a bit of a pushed tone. It sounds quite cool, so it's not my usual like mega juicy like Petrucci style solo tone, but I think the backing was asking for something a little bit drier, a bit more exposed. I think it's worked really well. I'm actually a big fan of the tone that I came up with in the end. Yeah, so full of juice, and it's got a good amount of overdrive in front of it. You can see it's actually like halfway up on the drive, which is unusual for me, as well as a little bit of compression as well. And there's some harmonies going on. So we've got some stuff here. And then we've also got... So together, just adds a little bit more interest, and it's a good way to add a bit of focus on you know, like select moments that you've got in your solos and your melodies as well. And I've done a similar thing here, like it's the exact same tone for the second half of the solo, but it's a bit more boosted actually. I think I've added even more level, so it has even more like saturated juice going on, just to kind of push through, because the backing gets a little bit more dense, so I wanted the solo to continue to grow with that backing as well. Yeah, awesome. Just a bit more high-end boost on that, and cutting some of that like boxy mid-range from the solo, and in context it sounds a little bit like this. So it just sits nicely on top of the arrangement there. And the final little bit of lead guitar playing from me is the last chorus, which is exactly the same tone as the first chorus, and exactly the same sort of harmony ideas going on as well. That's all of the like overdriven lead guitars. So now we're onto the clean guitars, of which there's only a few. It's mainly the intro and this intro riff. We've already covered the first three and the riff as well. So all we've got to touch on here is this intro clean. And I think it sounds really cool. So this is actually going through a little bit more processing. So we've got a bit of more dramatic EQ going on. And what I'll do is I'll take everything off bar the gain, because no doubt that's reducing the volume. Yes, it is. And I'll just play these in solo, and you can kind of hear what's happening. So the first time through, they're playing in unison. And then the second time through, they're playing in like a thirds harmony. So it's a really nice sound. It's like a pushed matchless sort of vibe. I really like how this sounds, but it was way too like muddy in like the 300, 500 range, especially in comparison to my other guitars. So these are just the pair of EQs doing the exact same thing on left and right. And then we have a multipressor doing the same thing again, just clamping down on like any like low flub notes. Mainly that little part where it goes to the low E flat. And a bit more of a cut, even more at 500 Hertz, and just a little boost at 1K. I'll have done this probably once again after I've put it into the mix, and I'm kind of hearing like, you know what, there's probably still a bit too much low end, so I've removed a bit more. And finally, we have a pair of Soothe plugins doing guitar de-spike. So this just reduces that sort of 2 to 4K harshness. And I think you can kind of hear a little bit of that in the tone. and this just helps to not remove it, but just take the edge off it. And I think, in my opinion, like soloed, this sounds a little bit too thin. I think I've removed too much EQ. At the end of the day, like, you're not mixing this to be heard soloed. So if I put it in context with the rest of the band, I think it makes a lot more sense. And I think it slots in just nicely into the rest of the mix. Without the EQs, it's just way too overpowering for the low end. So this is what it sounds like in, and I'm just going to take the first EQs off, like, because I think they're the biggest move that we've got going on here. I think you'll hear the difference. Quite a tricky one to balance, actually. That took me a while to get that sat just right, considering the riff is so intricate and delicate. To try and get it to just be nested properly on top of like the supporting synths and layers that we've got going on, which we'll dig into next. Yeah, I'm really happy with how that turned out, and that is literally it for the clean guitars, bar a tiny little chordal idea that's just a quad cortex print, and it's just got some EQ on it. The reason why that EQ is there, it's less of a mixing decision, more of a production decision. I wanted it to be quite thin sounding, so when it hits the chorus again, it goes quite large. So that, in some contexts, sounds like this. Awesome, so that's the clean guitars. Okay, so guitar layers, of which there is a number of them. And there's a couple printed audios here from Rabia, as well as a number of quad cortex layers, and they're doing loads of cool stuff. So you can sort of recreate these sounds and maybe even the concepts if you like the sound of them. This is less mixing, like there's only an EQ to cut out the low end, it's just not needed in this sort of stuff. And boosting a bit of mid-range, I'm thinking like these are going to fill out more of the mid-range and the gaps in between the main instruments. So I'm trying to have my producer hat on here and think less like a guitarist, trying to think what does the song need at any given moment and fill in those gaps. But nevertheless, let's just take a listen to, you know, just a few things that we've got going on. So over the verse sounds like this normally, and then I'm going to take the guitar layers out. I think what I'm going to do as well, I'm just going to take the lead guitar out just so you can hear what the rest of the instruments are doing. So you can probably sort of hear what those tape layers are doing left and right. So soloed, we've just got like a little bit of a clean, super delay, super reverb, and it's a tape delay. So you get that vibe, a little bit of wobbly distortion, and a bit of flutter in the pitch as well sometimes. So we have a pair of post layers that come in on the second half of the verse, and no doubt they're just going to be classic delay, mono delay in front of overdriven amp. You can do this with Archetype Nolly, you can do this with Archetype Pliny, and it just sounds great. Like the delays wash into the distortion and it just sounds like super messed up, but in a really cool way. So note what I've done there. Even in the performance, it's quite like sassy, and it's really slow bends. It's quite discordant as well as dissonant. I think that really works given the harmony of the piece. Not to be too composition dense, but just keep in mind when you're adding layers like this, maybe try and get a bit of, you know, your own personality in there. And I was thinking, like, rather than just transitioning from like semitone to the next one, which is all it is, they're just in harmony with each other, why don't you just bend really slowly so it gives you that split second of, oh, where's it going? And then it drops back down. So it's, again, that breathing up and breathing down. I don't know why, I was just really leaning into that vibe. Together, they sound like this. Awesome. So yeah, that's a flavor of the tape layers. They're not really doing anything. There's just gains on those. There's no processing. There's literally nothing on those. And yeah, just straight into that guitar layers stack. I've done some more post layers for the pre-chorus and the chorus. So that's just kind of reinforcing the harmony that's going on. What I'll do, so you can hear, because out of context they sound a bit weird, right? So I'm going to play them with them in on this chorus. Again, no melody, I'll make it a bit easier for you. And when I take them out, like the ambience drops a little bit, even though there is orchestra in the chorus, but not much. I think they're the perfect bridge between the guitar and the rest of the band and what the guitar sounds like in the context of this track. But then you have the post layers, and I think they perfectly talk like a handshake between the orchestra and the guitar parts. You have these post layers playing the same part as the orchestra. Again, I always end up talking about composition when I'm doing these mix breakdowns, but yeah, from a mix perspective, there's nothing going on. They're just prints of some audio that I recorded. So yes, and they're just going into the instrument bus. Yeah, post-chorus is kind of cool. I can't remember what's going on here, so let's listen to some Rabia print. Okay, cool. So all that's happening here is I must have just wanted a slightly different flavor compared to this for the post-chorus. A bit more like low end that's filling out the rest of the space. This is quite hi-fi, delicate sounding, I think, which works well for a spacious sort of verse. And yeah, I mean, the rest of it is just more post layers. I'm not really doing anything too much more interesting than that on the guitar layers. I mean, we're getting to the home stretch now. Synths, I mean, we've got 2 in this entire session, and the only thing that they're doing is doubling up the clean guitar riff the first time, the second time, and the last time through. So they sound like this, and they're just a pair of Polymax synths from UA. And I started off with a preset, and I think I tweaked it a fair amount, so it sounds like this anyway. Yeah, they're quite thin, quite raspy. They're going through an oxide tape machine, and again, both of them have got identical processing, just left and right. So let me take the channel EQ off, leave the oxide on, and then you can hear what that is doing. Just even leaning into that raspiness a bit more, accentuating that like high cut off point, and yeah, just giving it a little bit more sauce. And EQ, all that's happening here is just cutting out unnecessary stuff. I do this a lot. I think a lot of people do. It's a good thing to get in the habit of. Soloed, this is going to make this sound too thin, but you're never going to listen to this soloed other than in this video, of course. So you have to ask yourself, as the mixing engineer, as the producer, is the low end of this synth part needed for the greater good, I suppose, of the song? Like, what purpose does it serve? I'm after this because it's adding a lot of high-end sizzle to my guitar part. The guitar part's got already enough low end in it, so I don't need it here. All it's going to do is kind of muddy things up when it doesn't really need to be there. So anyway, this is what the EQ is doing. Cool. And throughout the song, I do this a couple times, so they do come back with the post-chorus as well. I think in this context, you can actually hear even more so what the synths are contributing to the sound. And this is why I like to use synths in this particular function sometimes, just to, you know, add to a guitar sound rather than contribute a completely separate part in terms of the arrangement. It's more like they're just melding to the guitar sound. And I think what you can really hear, like I was just saying, in this particular example is how much rhythm they're adding to the riff. So they're locking down the rhythm and also adding, I mean, their attack and decay is quite different to the guitar tone. The tone of the guitars is more just like a fluid constant of a sound, whereas the synths have got more of a spike on the attack. I did that on purpose to let them cut through in the mix without having to like EQ a load more than what I already have done. So yeah, and that is it for the synths, the entire track. Most of the design of the sound and the additional layers is coming from the orchestra. I really love doing this with orchestra, more so than synths. That might change in the future. I also consider piano part of the orchestra just because of the way I use it. So in the verse, under the track stack U3, it's called U3 just because the original Intimate Grand from Spitfire is modeled after a Yamaha U3 piano, so it just makes it easier in my brain. As soon as I see U3, I know what I'm referencing. So in the verse, these two different piano parts are doing just the same chords that the layers are doing, and you get, well, it's going to bring a piano quality to the verse. So they sound like this, and they're both panned left and right, you know, respectively. And then in context, the piano, I think, really adds a bit more of an ethereal quality to the verse. I think you can really hear it that second time round. Cool. It's also in the chorus, which is quite fun, and it's sort of doubling the melody. So this is what that sounds like. Oh, and it's worth saying, just on those two, there's a bit of EQ here. So on these two in the verses, just a real simple EQ on the both of them. Just cutting a lot of, yeah, like those low frequencies, and then, yeah, about 7.5K, we're beginning to roll off at 24 dB an octave. Okay, awesome. And for the chorus, I've got another instance of it. It's actually playing, yeah, more of a melody. And that sort of contributes more to the rest of what the orchestra is doing. So let's take a look at the orchestra in the chorus. And again, same EQ. And inside the originals, I'm just using the reverb that comes with the library. So yeah, pretty simple stuff right there. The U3 actual bus, just a tiny cut. Not really doing too much there. Anything that might be trying to build up around the 250 Hertz region. So yeah. So let's listen to the orchestra in the chorus. Cool, so all we've got for the chorus is, it's not as involved as the intro. I didn't want any brass in the chorus. I think it would be too large and too much of a focus on the orchestra. So we've just got all of the strings bar the double basses, and they are playing. So the mix is exactly the same as what we've already covered in the intro. Just show you the parts. Cool, there's no woodwind either, and The tuned percussion is just one of my favorite combos, just Celeste and Glock. And the only thing I'm doing here is they're both playing the same part and they're just an octave apart. So what you'll find is that the Celeste and the Glock really contribute each other well, and I always put the Celeste, well, not always, I often put the Celeste an octave below the Glock. So what you have is, well, the Celeste first, then the Glock, and then I'll put them together. And then when you combine that with the piano, you get this. And now let's bring in my lead guitar. So you can hear how it's playing a really supportive role of my main melody. So it's not fighting the guitar part, it's actually quite quiet, but in the mix it still cuts through. We'll move on to just the ending. I just want to highlight what's happening at the end because I do think it's important to the mix, and yeah, then we'll round it out. So when we come to reprise the main theme, we've changed the harmony of it though. We're no longer in Phrygian dominant. We're now in, I can't remember the scale, but I think it's one of the major modes. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it, which is a fun little, you know, Easter egg. I wanted to get in there because this is actually the original idea. If you go back and watch that Bare Knuckle demo song, this is exactly what the original idea was supposed to be, but I actually changed the harmony of it when I rewrote the song. So it's a nice little callback, and it's an uplifting moment because it's like a return to home, but a little bit of a brighter theme, more triumphant, cinematic, kind of prosperous. Like, I wanted it to feel like this sort of grand ending to this song, with like a strong return to the home, really. So the key thing that happens here is, rather than just having more orchestra come in on the second time, which is what happens, hopefully you heard this sort of introduction, like letting everyone know the orchestra's coming. And again, it's my main two people right here, Celeste, Glock, octave apart. There's probably some brass supporting that line as well. We've got some notes here. And I think the just general volume of the orchestra increases with automation. You can see I've got a little bit here, and throughout the track I've got a lot of automation. I'll touch on that in a second because there's a lot of automation that I like to do in my mixes. But yes, let's just listen to the orchestra on its own, because I do think, you know, throughout this video we've been talking about the mix, we've been talking about compression, EQ, all this sort of stuff. I do think the arrangement and the actual piece and what the instruments are playing is just as important as the mix. It's something I believe. You can disagree, but if the orchestra is not playing the correct part for the song, no amount of EQ and compression is going to make it sound good, in my opinion. So I do feel like the orchestra, for me, even every time I hear this now, I feel like, not goosebumps, but just like, wow, this is actually a really cool section that I've got going on here. And I'm really happy with it. And I feel like any of you who do make music should chase that feeling. You should want to be making the music that you hear in your head, that maybe doesn't exist. And once you get it out, it feels great. Chase all of those little like eureka moments that can happen when you're writing music. And for me, the eureka moment was this little introductory line when the rest of the orchestra comes in. So let's just talk about the orchestra only in this section, and let's just take a listen to it. Okay, cool. So let's just dig into a few parts. So yeah, obviously we have strings. So let's take a listen to that. And I think, again, I've only used double basses on the very last note there. So yeah, probably not really realistic of a real orchestra. They'd probably be doing a little bit more. But I just feel like it just works. Like when that last chord hits, that's when the basses enter, and it's like, that's the end of the song. So yeah, they're doing nothing new in terms of mix. I just wanted to let you hear what they were doing in solo. It might give you some ideas. And similar for the brass, they are, I mean, it's only 3 things here, which is actually mad for how large it sounds. They are playing multiple notes, which I don't know how realistic that is, but let's take a listen. And then, yeah, the cool thing is, so after this little introduction by the Celeste and the Glock, the tenor trombones come in as well. And of course, probably the biggest sound in this thing is the French horns. And let's just add in the tuned percussion. I just wanted to show off briefly there that on the brass throughout this entire track, I do have EQ. So this, for example, is the tenor trombones, and this is the bass trombones. And it's just to get more of a modern sound out of the brass. Like for me, like there's a lot of mid-range in the brass. So that's why I just decided to do really simple EQ moves. You know, we're talking like, yeah, just essentially pulling down 500 hertz by 8 dB and then pushing, yeah, the high end just to get that brassy sound a bit more, make them sound a bit more aggressive as well. So yeah, I really like what everything is doing in that section. And yeah, what I want to do is just before that introduction by the Celeste and Glock, I'm just going to take the orchestra out so that you can hear what the rest of the arrangement is doing. And I think you'll agree it does lose that like grandiose sort of vibe. So let's just mute it and then play it from here. Yeah, just doesn't have the same effect in my opinion. I love the sound of the orchestra. Yeah, the cool thing with this mix I do like is the fact that we've gone from, there's actually quite a curve to how little instruments we actually end up in. I've never noticed this before. I've done this by accident. So we literally, in the big riff, which is probably the heaviest section of the piece, there's 2 guitars, a bass and a drum kit. And that's it, and barely any bass at that. It's mostly just guitars, even though it sounds the heaviest in terms of production. So, and this is something I heard from Simon Grove as well. Like a lot of people, I think, when they want to make something as heavy as possible, they will spend time adding layers, post-production, synths, doubled synths, orchestra. What I've actually found writing more and more music is actually 2 guitars that are as well recorded as you can manage, a bass that is as good as you can manage once again, and drums that are programmed or played, once again, to the best of your ability, I find if those are dialed and locked in, I don't think you can get heavier than that. If everything is produced and the source tones, mainly the source tones, are as good as possible, you don't have to do too much work to get like a really good sounding mix. It's not to like understate how much effort and time that I've spent to try and get this to sound at least half decent, but I do think they are the three key ingredients to getting something that sounds pretty large. And then, as you can see, we've gone to this, in terms of arrangement, really small point, but in terms of sound, it's probably like I said before, probably the biggest. And then we slowly add everything back in. I can't believe I've never noticed this before. I didn't even do it on purpose. I just thought like the riff should just be all focus on the guitars. Let's just quickly touch on automation. So whilst, looking at all of the sums, there isn't too much going on. I think the room mic on the drums is always doing a lot of heavy lifting. I think that's probably a wise decision. Like, you don't want your verse to have this huge cannon shot snare drum. So just compare the sound of this to something like this, the second half of the chorus. And then you can see it drops back down again. So don't be afraid to get creative with mixing. I think that should be somewhat of a theme of this video. We've got a little bit more on the bass bus, and even, really specific moments, like when I played this bass line and I did this little run in between the bass drum part, I think it stuck out quite a lot, probably a little bit too much. So I just reduced the volume just for that particular run. You can see like 3 dB reduction, but it sounds the same volume. So without this, you'll notice how loud it is. And that's just the nature of like popping and slapping strings, at least in my case. I'm still trying to get a little bit more consistent with my bass playing. So yeah, there's a little bit more automation, just classic trick when you've got a chorus, actually dropping the guitars a little bit so that your melody can be a bit louder. So for the pre-chorus, they're about 0.7 dBs louder. And then when it gets to the chorus, they drop a bit. So just small details, they all help carve out the space for the melody to sit on top. Did the same thing with the beer guitars. I dropped them down quite a lot and then kept them at that volume for the rest of the track. And a really good reason why I send like individual families of the orchestra to their own sums is so that I can do stuff like this with not much stress. Like, I'm not having to copy paste automation onto flutes, piccolo, so on and so forth. I can just do it once and then kind of bring it back down when I want to do a different part. And I don't really have to worry so much about trying to balance everything that way. It's actually why I use a lot of gain plugins. So I'm not doing it in this case, but I like to use my volume faders mainly for automation. I do a lot of my gain staging with gain plugins instead. I just find that it helps me personally massively. So like here I've got -2 on the brass sum, but it still means I can play around with the automation on the actual volume, but it's not affecting what my original, let's call it like the original volume was set at. So yeah, just keep that in mind. What I would do is I would set the volume where I wanted it in the mix, and then I would start automating the volume. And then I would forget like, oh, hang on, I just want to not, actually all I want to do is bring the brass down 5 dB just across the board, including all of the automation. And then I'd like highlight all of the volume automation and drag it down and try and, like squint and see if it was 5 dBs. But even if you had done a load of automation with volume, you can just get a gain plugin like this and then go from there and then control everything just with one easy dial. So that's one of my tips that I would recommend. And then yeah, just a little bit more automation, just trying to control little pieces here and there. Okay, cool. I think that just about wraps up everything to do with this mix. The only thing I've not covered is the master bus, and that will just take like 1 second, just because it is literally just flatline 2. Since I mastered this, I have been using the God particle just to add a little bit of multiband compression and some harmonic distortion to my masters. But this was mastered a while ago and I was just using flatline 2. And let me just play a chorus so you can see whereabouts my luffs are at. If I was to master this again, I would master it a little bit more dynamically, like a bit quieter, a bit more transparent, and I would probably, yeah, use God particle in front of flatline with, I usually use God particle with like no limiter, just a little bit of character and that's it. But anyway, this is what has been on the entire video. So yeah, this is what flatline's doing. By all means, copy these settings. I'm pretty sure they're default. And yeah, this is how loud it is. So I'm using it in the hybrid mode. I think it does a really good job of clipping and limiting, and I think it's transparent enough and it gets enough volume. And I didn't feel the need to do too much to the master. I just was already liking what it sounded like at the time. And yeah, just found the perfect level to get the most volume out of it. Again, if I was to do it again, I'd make it a bit quieter. And then the limiter here is just safety precaution, just in case for some reason something gets past flatline. And that's just fast release, look ahead maximum, and then minus 0.1 on the output, just to trim it tiny bit. I think what we should do is listen back to the entire song with the view of Logic. I quite like doing that, so you can see each of the individual parts as they come and go. I think that just about concludes the video. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I'm so sorry that it was so long. I tried to keep it concise. I didn't really manage that, but if you're still here, thank you so much. 1, for the support, 2, for checking out the song, 3, for watching all of this video. You're crazy, but I love all of you. Enjoy the Logic view of A Chord Beyond, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.